Welcome to Baha'i on Air. I'm Kirsten Zemke White. In this program, we are featuring a discussion with Dr. Duane Varan from Murdoch University in Perth, Australia. Welcome back to New Zealand, Dr. Varan.
Kia ora. It's great to be back in New Zealand.
Dr. Varan lectures in marketing and media in the Department of Business at Murdoch University, and he consults with global advertising agencies about new technologies. Tonight he's going to talk to us about youth and young people and where they're at and some different ways about thinking about youth from a Baha'i perspective. Duane, when you say the word youth, what do you actually mean as a term?
I think that there's a lot of different ways. We use that term kind of very freely in society to refer to different things. But I think mostly where the term kind of comes into play is there's a period after kids leave school, and there's a period perhaps between that and when they get married. And that period generally, I think, refers to this era of youth. And it's characterized by different qualities. Sometimes in the press, they're kind of negative qualities. You know, people are worried about youth crime and youth drugs and, you know, these types of things, which is a very negative dimension to it. We can talk about it in commercial terms, in terms of like the youth market, which is a booming market in a lot of ways. But again, I think that really what it is it's a turning point in life. When people are kids, if you will, decisions are largely made for them, and they're in an environment where, you know, perhaps they have to follow some rules. I mean, that's a period fraught with its own tensions within the household, if you will. Later on in life, I guess they have mortgage payments, and they've got different levels of responsibilities, and they're kind of tied into a 9-to-5 type of job in many cases. There is that period in between, which is kind of like this big turning point in life. And many of the most critical decisions in life are actually made in that period. Who you'll marry, what career you'll have, etc., what values you'll ultimately uphold. So in a lot of ways, the period of youth is kind of like a compass. It sets the direction which people then basically build their lives around. So it's probably the most critical phase, if you will, in people's development.
What role do you feel youth play in society? This is a distinctive time of life. What is the significance of this slice of our existence?
Well, I think part of the problem in our societies is that we don't have a sense of purpose for that period. For most of the other periods of our lives, if you will, your sense of purpose in being is very well defined. That period of youth, you really go into very ambiguous, a very nebulous, what should you be doing in that period? And there are different ways that gets reflected. I mean, at one extreme, you have the idea of, you know, pure hedonism and partying, just kind of wasting away those years, just waiting for those years to kind of go by. In another sense, you have this idea that people should be doing something so that they can be something. And it's kind of positioned into the future. So it's like, now you don't matter, but someday you will. So you go to college. Why do you go, or uni? Why do you go to uni? So that you can graduate and become something. There's just not enough of a sense of purpose around that period of youth. And so in that sense, I think it's a little bit nebulous exactly what the role of youth is. Now, in actual fact, I think that period of youth can be the most constructive socially. One of the general characteristics about being young, and it's hard sometimes for the young to understand that because they don't actually have a comparative basis, but one of the things about that period is that you're really free from responsibility in a lot of ways. Once you have kids, you have a lot of responsibilities to your children. Even when you're married, you've got responsibilities to somebody else in your life. When you're young, a lot of that responsibility is kind of, to some extent, defined or shaped for you. This is a period, a unique period in their lives.
Well, as they say, youth is wasted on the young. This extreme unhappiness and lack of purpose that you talked about, obviously in its extreme form, can end up in suicide, which is a big problem facing young people today. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, you're right. Suicide is certainly the most extreme end of the spectrum, but the whole idea of experimentation, which is often closely tied to that period of youth, is also a reflection. Because that sense of purpose is not kind of clear, people are trying to, if you will, discover that. And in that process of discovery, they're not only resorting to different ideas, possibilities, etc. But they're also often resorting to things which are quite dangerous. Drugs, I mean, a variety of things. And suicide is the most dangerous side of that, because there can be, in that quest, a sense of hopelessness, a sense of a lack of purpose, a sense of failure. And where that sense becomes, where they can't kind of see beyond that, where they can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, then that's where I think that's reflected in, the extreme form, which of course would be suicide. And as we know, in New Zealand and in Australia, the suicide rates are phenomenally high. And that's telling us that this is not a problem which is limited to a few people. When we have rates that are that high, particularly relative to other societies, that's telling us that as a society we are failing, that there is something wrong that we are doing as a society. And I believe that what we're doing wrong as a society is we're ignoring our youth. And that lack of, that blind spot that we've created, is reflected in these negative social trends, youth crime, drugs, ultimately suicide. And our response to that really should be to wake up and smell the coffee and come up with a much more exciting, if you will, sense of vision, sense of purpose for that period, a much more meaningful role for that element of our society.
I liked what you said about listening to young people. Marilyn Manson, who himself is a sort of an outrageous rock star, who some people might think is a bad influence on young people. In fact, they tied him to the sort of Columbine shooting. When they asked him what he would like to say to Eric and Daryl, the two boys who did the shooting, and he said, "I don't want to say anything, I'd like to listen to them." That was the whole problem, we weren't listening to them. So I think that's a good point that you make about listening to young people. But on the other hand, even though youth are particularly vulnerable and this is a very difficult time in their life, in some ways youth have a lot of power as consumers. The whole market's driven towards them. They're the ones eating McDonald's, drinking Coke, and wearing Nikes. So in some ways they have a lot of power.
Well, that's right. Actually, where most of the major kind of global brands have come to recognize is that certainly when you're talking about their profit margins, the youth market is a significant market. And what we've seen in the 80s and 90s is much more clarity of focus in the youth market. In fact, they're one of actually the few people who have listened to youth. And they're expressing their voice and making a lot of money in the process. They've become a badge of identity for youth. And you better believe that they're spending a lot of money doing the market research to find out exactly what issues youth care about, etc. So I think you're right. The global brands have, in fact, been listening, and they've turned their business models around to ensure that they're responding. And as a result, I think they're making a lot of money in the process. That's true.
So in some ways, the youth are buying a lot, and they're, sort of subsumed in this sort of shallower aspect of life, even if it is perhaps to mask the pain. I don't see today's young people having huge causes and fighting for injustice, say like they did in the 60s. That sort of political activism doesn't seem to be happening now in as big a scale as it could.
Well, I don't know that it's fair to argue that youth aren't politically active. I think what it is that youth are rejecting our understanding of political activism. And I think to a large extent it's because they don't believe in that sense of political activism. And to a large extent, I think there is a lot of sense in that frustration, their frustration, if you will, with the political activism of old. If you look at the whole idea of protest, which was really big, of course, in the 60s, that worked largely because the world was asleep, because people didn't know that there were problems, because people thought the world was a happy, chirpy kind of place. The feminist movement, for example, said, no, you're not alone in feeling your frustrations and thinking it's part of your own problem. It's actually a wider social problem. And with the race issue, people said we shouldn't have to put up with this anymore. And so there was a whole expression of protest, which was kind of like a wake-up call, so that people who thought that the world was fine suddenly began looking at it thinking, wow, we've got problems. And another way that today we kind of construct political activism is around the power of the vote. And there's this whole mythology that, voters have the power to change things. And to some extent it's true, but we're not talking radical change. Whether it's one party that's elected or another party that's elected, the youth don't believe that there is dramatic change between one party versus the other party. So again, a lot of their sense of wanting to change the world is not really fulfilled in the political activism of old. And so what there is there's a void. There's a void for a meaningful way for the youth to build a better world. And where the consumer brands have stepped in and kind of taken advantage of that has been, if you will, to badge that identity. So you have companies like Benetton, et cetera, which have come up with the idea of promoting diversity. And this is an identity which the youth relate to. They're like, yes, that's the world I want to live in. And so that's the reason why that whole engine works. So it's not that that will make the world a better place, and it's not necessarily that youth believe that that's their method, if you will, of political activism, but that's how that void has been filled. We still have that void. The youth are still, if you will, looking, searching for a meaningful way to, if you will, apply their energy in some way that will, build the world they want to live in. But unfortunately, youth don't know, don't understand what that vehicle is, and so they're kind of left in this void.
So can you perhaps read it in a way that because in one way young people are all connected across racial, class, and national boundaries, they've achieved a sort of a global youth culture. So in a way they've transcended what governments and adults haven't been able to do, and that has actually sort of come together and actually converse and dialogue between disparate groups.
Well, you're absolutely right. There is a global youth culture. When you look at different segments across countries, there is no other group of people that you could look at and say provides, if you will, a global culture than that culture of youth across the world. Now, again, to some extent, that has been enabled by the consumer brands, the Coca-Colas of the world. And the negative side of that is that much of that global youth culture is quasi-American in its character. And in a lot of ways, that American culture has a multicultural message that it's selling, which is part of the reason why it can transcend culture. But I think that aspect of it is probably not a good thing. And clearly, it serves, if you will, a commercial purpose. And that side of it maybe perhaps is not a good thing. Although, in some ways, I'm not bothered by the fact that that at least is expressing positive messages of globalism and how we're all one people and how women have rights. And I mean, I think there is a lot of positive message, if you will, in that global youth culture. But very clearly it is one on the negative side, which is ultimately dominated by American corporations. But again, the positive side is that we've long held ideals of transcending our differences. And a lot of that actually happens at a human level. A lot of that is not about governments meeting and trying to solve treaties and things like that. It's at a very human level of us transcending our national boundaries and developing bonds so that we truly come to perceive ourselves as citizens of one planet rather than having our strong allegiances primarily to our national groups above and beyond others. And that type of global culture is emerging within the youth culture. And so in that sense, I think it's a very positive reflection of the type of culture that's emerging.
So what do you think the Baha'i Faith has to offer young people?
Well, I think the real proof in the pudding, if you will, about the contributions that the Baha'i community makes is when you actually look at youth within the Baha'i community. And I'm very proud of our youth. I think that, our youth are real, true role models for the society at large. Not only because of, the types of lives that they live, not only because of the sense of purpose, but also because of the degree to which they work to better the world and, if you will, the methodology that they've discovered in doing that. Because, again, so much of what I was arguing earlier is that youth are a significant force in our society. They're probably the most significant force for social change, but that there's this void because they have this enormous energy, but they don't know how to channel that energy. They don't know how to channel that frustration. And so what we need then is a positive vehicle for them to take the vision they have of the world they want and actually work to build it. And I think that's what the Baha'i community has done. What I think is really refreshing about the Baha'i perspective is that it's not geared around protest. It's not geared around the negative. It's not geared around what you don't like. So it's geared around the positive. It's geared around what you do want. It's geared around having a sense of vision about the type of society that you want and then working to build that society. So let's take an issue like race, which is very loaded, a very difficult issue, whereas much of that voice in society at large is a voice of protest about things that people don't like. What I find very refreshing about the Baha'i view is that it's a positive expression of cultural diversity, of racial unity, and it channels itself saying, this is the society we want to build. And when you look at social movements, I think the greatest change has actually come about not only because you've had a rejection of what you don't want, but because you've also had a sense of what to do about it. That's what's missing in society at large. Everybody knows that systems don't work anymore. That's not new. To stand up and say, this is wrong, is not new. People know that. What people don't know is what to do about it. And that's where I think really the Baha'i youth are a very positive force. And they take that message and they put it on the road. They perform in song and dance and drama. They get together and they have really serious discussions. And they talk about the world. And they talk about the world they want and what things should be like and how they're going to make a difference. And out of that discussion, their careers are shaped. Their lives are shaped. So they're an active force, a small force, a very limited force, if you will, in the reach that it has to kind of change society. But it's a force which I think is doing it the right way. It's geared in the positive, it's engaged with the issues, it's trying little by little, day by day, to make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I always use the example, say Martin Luther King, he changed the laws, but he couldn't eliminate racism. That had to come from a more internal place.
I think that's actually worth exploring a little bit more because Martin Luther King, there were a number of different components that were successful, I guess, in his particular approach. There was a protest element, which was necessary in its day, but if that's all it was, I don't think the movement would have been successful. The thing about Martin Luther King, I think, that was far more successful than the protest was actually there was a positive vision about what to do about it. So it wasn't just saying we think racism is wrong, it was also a message of hope. It was a positive, constructive message which said to white America, this is below your dignity. This is a vision of the type of society that we should be a part of. And that was a compelling vision. It was a vision which captured the imagination of white America as well. So suddenly you had people who were receptive to change, eager for change, instead of what we often have, which is a battle for change. As long as we construct this as a battle, there's a win and there's a lose. And as long as there's a win and a lose, it's going to be very difficult for us to have meaningful change. What we need to do is construct it as a win-win, and the way we construct win-win is with vision. Where there's vision and where that vision is compelling, where that vision is attractive, people want change. And ultimately, that's how we see meaningful change in our society.
So sort of like a Baha'i perspective, you're arguing that he had a spiritual base, the kind of changes he was making had a sort of a deeper aspect to it.
I think that's true. I think, again, I think when we use the word spiritual, people often misconstruct that word. So they think of institutions, they think of church. But spirituality is not about the institutionalization of religion. It's about the spirit which animates our soul, the spirit which animates who we are, the qualities, the characteristics of, the triumph, if you will, of the human soul. So when we think about then the qualities that make us human, fairness, justice, love, these things, these are the qualities that define spirituality. And absolutely, whenever you're talking about positive, constructive social change, Ultimately, you're talking about spirituality. You're talking about empowering those positive characteristics of the soul. So there's no doubt about it that whenever you're really talking about meaningful, social, positive change, you're appealing to those characteristics, the sense of fairness in people, a sense of justice, a sense of compassion, etc. So ultimately, deep down at their core, these movements, these social movements, are inherently really spiritual movements.
So you talked earlier, and we've talked about youth feeling a sense of a lack of purpose. What do you think their purpose should be?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think that youth do have an enormous amount of power, and they can construct a huge amount of social change, and they should. Civilization should not be about what it is today. Civilization should be climbing. We should be ever advancing. We should be living in a world where every day our world gets better. Now, what we live in is a world where technically every day the world gets better, but spiritually every day the world is getting worse. So we have a really strange kind of dichotomy. And the reason is because we have scientists, and we have engineers, and we have all these people who apply their energy to materially making the world better. But who is applying their energy to spiritually making the world better? In other words, those qualities, those characteristics that we were talking about. And again, youth can be champions of making the world truly better, because we're going to have those technological advances because it's in people's commercial interest. At the same time, we need people who are out there making the world better through these spiritual qualities, if you will, so that we can live in a world which is truly better than it was yesterday, not which is better but worse.
Okay, so on the one hand, we've talked about how youth are perhaps vulnerable to ideologies and advertising. And the other hand, you've talked about their need for spirituality. How are they supposed to find this spirituality when they're so vulnerable and susceptible? How do they find a true spirituality which will give them purpose, but not possibly harm them or be dangerous?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Youth are vulnerable. And it's very easy for that concern that they have to get appropriated by others in a lot of different ways. And I don't know that it's always positive. Even oftentimes it can be in social movements, and it can get channeled, I think, in some very destructive ways. And so I think it is important for youth to be on guard for exactly that type of thing. And there are a lot of, I think, very unhealthy expressions of that. People who are out there who basically take advantage of that need that youth have. So I think that, that it is important, it's critical for youth to be skeptical. I don't think that they should accept things wholesale. I think that they have to investigate. They're very good at being skeptical. Really, ever since Gen X, onwards, I think cynicism has been characteristic with youth culture. And I think that in many ways that's a positive thing. If something really is good, it should withstand that test. But the problem is, it doesn't do any good to die a cynic. It doesn't do any good to die a skeptic. Being a skeptic is really good as a filter to make sure that whatever it is that you're talking about, is for real. But at some stage, you've got to go beyond skepticism, and you've got to actually then become a positive force for social change. So I think that's really where the balance is be skeptical, question, investigate. That's a good thing. Then when you find something that you think is meaningful, then give it your best go. Give it all you've got.
So when you were a young person, not that you're not young now, but when you were actually in this youth space that we're talking about, you were a Baha'i. So how did being a Baha'i help you or guide you or get you through this time in your life?
I am so grateful that I had the Baha'i influence as a youth. It made the biggest difference in my life. I think without the Baha'i Faith, I think I would have had a very different life. I think that the period of my youth would have been wasted. I would have basically been living day to day, having fun. I don't think I would have achieved a great deal. When I enrolled for uni and I sat my exams, I scored very low on my entrance exams. By all predictions, I should have been a dropout by the end of my first year of uni. I've gone on and I've got a PhD, and I guess by some measures I'm somewhat successful in life, and all of that really is directly attributable to the Baha'i influence in my youth, because I was consumed by a passion to build a better world. that passion made me look at my studies differently. Instead of me just sitting down in classes trying to pass exams and go through, I was in that with a sense of purpose. It shaped my career. It shaped, my travel. It shaped everything about who I've become. And the period of my youth was also a lot of fun. And it wasn't fun because I was out partying all the time or anything like that. It was fun because I was getting together with a lot of other like-minded youth, and we were sitting down and we were conspiring. We were conspiring about how we were going to change the world. We were out there participating in service projects. So I remember, one summer I was up in Eskimo villages, helping the Eskimos build community centers and things like that. And the next summer I'd be on the Navajo reservations helping them, and, in the islands of the Pacific and stuff. And it was not only socially constructive, it not only made me feel good, like I was making a difference, a small difference, but nonetheless, I was doing something about the problems of the world, but also it had a huge impact on shaping the rest of my life. So, and also on friendship, the friendships that we forge together are deep friendships. Friendships, I think, are formed by common experiences. And I think it's so much more powerful having that bond of friendship be around, people who are off in some village in the middle of nowhere building a community center than being at some party sitting down getting drunk all the time. I mean, there's just not a great deal of bonding that you can, meaningful bonding that you can kind of do in that context. But the type of friendships that we forged, in our youth are the type of friendships that are meaningful, lifelong. Now my friends are all over the world, and when I see them, we get together. I mean, it's great. So I'm very, very grateful to the Baha'i Faith because I think it has had a huge impact on my life, particularly through the influence that it had in shaping my youth.
Well, we'll have to wrap it up now, Dr. D. Thanks very much for coming to be with us on Baha'i on Air.
It's always a pleasure being on Baha'i on Air, anytime.
And thank you for joining us for Baha'i on Air. In this program, we've been talking to Dr. Duane Varan from Murdoch University in Perth, and we've been talking about youth and youth issues. My name is Kirsten Zemke White, and if you'd like to know any more about the things we've been talking about tonight or about the Baha'i Faith, you can hook up onto our website, www.bahai.org.nz. Please join us for Baha'i on Air again sometime, and ka kite.